Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to state right off that I'm going to share my time with my colleague from Strathcona. I'm very happy that we're having this debate. As my other colleagues, they asked for this emergency debate because this is a fundamental report issued by the United Nations and by the IPCC. It's a very important debate because it shows us as a government and on all governments throughout the world that we have to act together. And what we've been doing for 30 years is just making excuses for not doing anything. And that's what we've seen throughout negotiations. And I'm very happy to see with the Kyoto calls, Paris agreements, Copenhagen, governments meet and debate the issue. But at the end of the line, as a government, we're not arriving at a logical solution, a responsible solution, namely to set binding targets. And they make excuses during the negotiations. Paris is perhaps the most striking example. We want to go in this direction, but if we don't get there, there'll be no results. This can't work, Mr. Speaker. Canada cannot act alone. It's not a question as to whether we need to act alone, but do we want to be a world leader in the fight against climate change? We have to set the example and to say, yes, we're going to act and solve our own issues. And with other countries, we're going to incite them to do the same thing. I'm not going to be partisan, but there's some things we do have to underscore. The Paris Agreement proposed initially to limit climate change to 2 degrees by the end of the century. And eventually, Canada worked to have an objective of 1.5 degrees. And during the last report, it said that we had to have this as an objective. If Canada wants to attain such an objective by 2030, we have to have a reduction of 325,000 tons. According to the government figures right now, the best we could do would be to limit it to 500,000 as a target. This is problematic because if we're not able to set the targets of Paris, other countries won't be able to either. And some people say that if we act unilaterally, it could have a bad impact on our economy. We all have to act. This is a global organization we're talking about. So if we realize that we have to act and we have to have tools to do so, this means we have to talk about things such as a price on carbon. It could be a tax. It could be cap and trade for emissions. There's an economic consensus with economists that we have to act. And my economist friends talk about a pigou tax to try and change people's behavior. And the problem we have right now is there's no incentive to change our behavior. If we don't have such a mechanism in place, people will continue with their current lifestyles, and they may make a few minor adjustments, but they won't do anything to really change and stop themselves from hitting the wall that they're going to run up against. People want to drive their cars, and they need to drive electric cars with less gas consumption. We have to head in this direction, but we see an increase in the number of SUVs that are being sold. And it's the same thing across North America. Between what we should do and what people recognize we need to do and what is really doing, there's a gap there. We can't just talk about goodwill or encouraging people. I referred also
to the fact that for the last 30 years we haven't done much. We haven't done much because all nations of this world, including Canada, are finding ways every single conference not to do anything that could constrain them into action. Je lisais en fait dans
I read in a paper the commentaries of Johnson No. He was a U.S. negotiator, and he was part of the U.S. cabinet at the time, and he was in charge of leading negotiations on climate change in '89. And what he said was that political leaders at the time in 1989 were seemingly interested, pretending to be interested in the question. They had the right words, but actions were not followed up. And this is what we've seen recently. He said leaders don't want to make any clear commitments that could deprive them of important resources. And this is where we're at again today. Globenberg, who was head of the Jean Chrétien cabinet at the time, in terms of Canada's signature of the Kyoto Agreement at the time in 2002, when Canada decided to sign it, we knew it was ambitious and would be hard to achieve the objectives. He said it would be worse to do nothing. We had to sign it. But they didn't have any real intention, well, the Liberal government at the time didn't have any real intention of doing anything. So that's the problem we have. And then report after report, the IPCC tells us the same thing, that we're going to hit a wall. We know this. We have to act. And it won't be a unilateral solution from one government. We have to work together. But we're finding an excuse. We're not putting forth any concrete action. We're telling white lies. Or pretending to do something, even though the opposite is true. I'm afraid for future generations. Mr. Speaker, my children are in their 20s, and they are going to have to deal with the consequences of climate change and extreme weather events that we're seeing increasing more and more. For example, the forest fires in BC and the west of the United States, and the many heat waves we've seen. There was one in Montreal, and it killed more than 70 people. We never used to have this before. In the Bas-Saint-Laurent, in my region, it's rather humid, people know that, and there's very famous fog in my region, but for 2 summers in a row, there has been extreme droughts. And it didn't rain for more than a month and a half at the end of the summer. And this summer, it was the same thing. I was in Rimouski for the entire summer, and it only rained 4 or 5 days throughout the entire summer. And there was only one hay harvest because they didn't have enough to make another harvest. And this is in Quebec. The Agricultural Producers Union has rang the bell, and the last summer they said they saw the biggest drought in Quebec for 50 years. People are saying this, but where's the action? When we set targets and we do nothing to achieve them, and then the Liberal government says, we're heading in the right direction, we're going to Paris, and we have targets, we're not going to really change them, we'll keep the same targets. But if we didn't achieve our targets with the Conservatives, and we're still not meeting them with the Liberals, how can we make sure that Canada will do its share? I think we're one of the rare countries that is talking about this tonight within their governments. But if we're not doing anything, how can we give other countries lessons? How can we play a leadership role and transition to renewable energy? How can we transition to a greener economy and not just talk about job losses? Or we have to talk about opportunities. We have to talk about positive aspects, not just for us, but also for our children, for my children. Until we have such a vision, we will not be able to do much. We won't be able to play a leadership role like we would like to pretend. So, my friends here in the House of Commons, we have to stop making excuses. We have to do what needs to be done, and we have to look at what we can do right now, not just to meet the Paris targets, but also to work with our international partners so that they also can benefit from this transition that we have to make for future generations. Thank you very much.
For Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank my colleague, the Leader in the House for the NDP for his intervention today. And I think that the NDP and the Liberal Party see eye to eye on the majority of the issue as it relates to the need and the pressing requirement for change in terms of our habits and the way that we go about approaching climate change. I did hear him talk a little bit about, reduced consumption in certain areas and people that, encouraging people to get into smaller vehicles, and that's not really happening because the expansion of the sales of SUVs, so it doesn't seem to be trending in that area. But I would caution to be careful in this debate about suggesting that it's all about changing consumption and habits of people, because the reality of the situation is, he talked about electric vehicles. There are electric minivans out there now. A number of car manufacturers are talking about SUVs coming along that are electric in the coming months. But one of the fundamental problems that we have in this country, as I see it, and as it relates to this issue, is how we are going to square away the problem that we have of more and more governments that are getting elected, especially at the provincial level, that have agendas against these actions. And how do we go about, making sure that the message continues to get out there in light of the fact that, as we're seeing in Ontario and Quebec and other provinces, there's a trend away from this. How does he see us squaring off this political issue that we have?
The honourable member for Rimouski-Nejet. Les Basques.
Good question, actually. I think the first thing we need to do is to basically stop finding excuses not to do anything. I'm looking at my Conservative friends here. I do remember a time not long ago, and it was Stephen Harper who said that, where he saw the Kyoto Protocol as being a big socialist conspiracy. Like, it's one thing not to agree with the means and to say that the measures that are being put forward are misguided, could be improved on, or that can be said. We can actually improve on what's being proposed. But to actually basically state that this is a socialist conspiracy is trying to rally a base against any measure, any action. And I do remember in this House, in the last Parliament, when the Conservatives were the government, and we had two parties here, the NDP and the Liberals, and we were talking about cap and trade. And each time that we were mentioning cap and trade, the governments were talking about us wanting a tax. Why? Because they know that for their base, a tax is a bad thing, and nobody understands cap and trade, which is a market mechanism. So we need to have some good faith here. If we are acting in bad faith, I'm not saying that that's what my friends here are saying, but I've seen bad faith in this last Parliament about those issues. And unfortunately, when we're trying to attack the action being done, without saying we can improve on this, but this is a good base, we're not going anywhere. So this is why we need to stop saying it's all or nothing, and we need to start ensuring that the actions will be undertaken, be it transport electrification, for whom we actually have the only critic in the House on this issue, or be it on the establishment of the price on carbon, for which there is an international consensus among economists. We need to start agreeing that we are going to move forward instead of fighting the initiatives, because the future depends on it.
Questions et commentaires. Nous avons le temps pour...
We have the time for one very short question, but the honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Could you tell us one country that has respected the Kyoto Agreement? The honourable member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-Les Basques. What I've realized is that countries have talked a lot about the Kyoto Agreement, but didn't really want to sign it. Quebec did respect its commitments for Kyoto, and other countries could have done so if they had goodwill. The U.S. had no will to do anything, and in Canada, they only had nice words, but no real actions followed up. But if we looked at the actions that were done, the Conservatives did nothing. They even pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. The Conservatives have no lessons to give us about respecting our international commitments. because they had no intention of working with other countries to reduce emissions, and they eliminated any possibility of cooperation